Isaac Stonefish is a senior fellow for Asia Society's Center on U.S. China Relations and a contributor for Foreign Policy magazine, and joins us now to break this all down. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So in listening to President Moon, I thought it was very interesting. He said that, you can only have lasting peace through strong security, and that any further provocation from North Korea in terms of its nuclear ambitions will be met with a stern response. But we know that President Moon won the presidency partially because he campaigned on a more diplomatic approach towards North Korea. I'm wondering if you think these two leaders mean the same thing or hear the same thing when the words like stern response and strong security are used.
I really don't think they do, and I think both of them very politely laid out, well, polite for Trump, laid out different ways of wanting to deal with North Korea. Trump said the era of strategic patience is over and talked about further sanctions and very subtly threatened a military response. Moon kept his language more to things like a stern response. Moon also emphasized their shared goals of denuclearizing North Korea. That is something both sides agree on, and even China wants a nuclear-free Korean peninsula, but all three sides have different views on how to get there.
Right. Meanwhile, we have THAAD, the missile defense system that is firmly in place in South Korea. What do you think the sticking points are going to be when these two men get together and try and hammer out an approach towards North Korea?
I think THAAD is an important one. So Moon stopped the full deployment of THAAD, barring, want to do some sort of environmental survey, which most people just agree is a kind, polite way to do that. So that's going to be a big one. And China, as we know, is very anti-THAAD because they feel it's part of a missile defense system to contain them. That's going to be a really big one. Another thing, and Trump alluded to this, talked about a more fair way to share the cost of the roughly 29,000 American troops in South Korea. Moon ignored that in his remarks, and that could be something that the two sides get held up on.
Yeah, didn't he mention something when THAAD was being put in place? Didn't he mention something about South Korea picking up the tab for THAAD?
He did, he did, and that's been a big dispute. South Korea feels that it already pays enough for American troops in South Korea. Trump wants them to pay more.
So you mentioned China, and China is hovering above all of this. Let's talk about the impact that China may have on these negotiations. We know that the president tweeted out just a few days ago, maybe last week, about China, saying, hey, look, China tried to put pressure on North Korea. They tried, but they failed. It was kind of a nice, casual tweet. But what sort of impact will China have on these talks? Well, even though they're not at the table.
South Korea has to be very careful not to alienate China, which is its largest trading partner. And the U.S. actually has to start being careful not to alienate China if it wants to get anything done in North Korea. China is responsible for roughly 90% of North Korea's trade, and you can't economically isolate North Korea without working with China on this. So last week we saw that Trump tweet where he appeared, quite polite to China's President Xi Jinping. But yesterday we saw an announcement of sanctions on 2 Chinese individuals for working with North Korea, and we saw the announcement of a $1.4 billion arms sale to Taiwan. Taiwan, not directly related with North Korea, but it's a sign that the Trump administration is getting upset with Beijing not doing what Trump wants.
And China expressing their concern about those two decisions as well. Listen, we also have Major Garrett. He's standing by, Chief White House Correspondent. Major, you were out there during the joint statement. We were talking to Isaac Stonefish about the use of the phrases, a stern response, strong security. And, these two men may have different definitions for those phrases. We know that President Moon certainly favors a more diplomatic approach, or certainly he won his presidency partially because he said that a diplomatic approach may work with North Korea. And then there's President Trump. What did you hear that really stood out as the two men spoke?
So let's understand the backdrop of this visit. First of all, South Korea is emerging from an intense period of political turmoil. Intense political turmoil at probably the worst geopolitical time in the country's history with democracy. It has a former president now jailed in a scandal that rocked all of South Korean politics. So the first visit for this newly elected South Korean president was to come to the United States to establish the best kind of relationship possible with one of its strongest strategic allies, the United States. Now, President Trump raised several issues, some of which were glancingly noted by President Moon, some of which were ignored. Burden sharing, largely ignored. Confronting North Korea, agreed to, but in different and much more careful diplomatic language. And then President Moon basically said nothing about another key issue that President Trump has raised in these conversations, which is reciprocal trade. And by that, what the president means is trade more favorable to the United States. Remember, the original U.S.-South Korea trade deal was negotiated first by President Bush, renegotiated by President Obama. And even though those two previous American presidents, one Republican, one Democrat, put that deal together, President Trump still regards it as a lousy deal, his words, for American workers. And so he wants greater access for U.S. vehicles and other products in South Korea, something the two nations are trying to work on. But I think the larger backdrop is the symbolic importance of South Korea emerging from this political turmoil, attaching itself to the United States, making the best of the symbolic representation of the alliance for as long as it can to signal to North Korea, hey, whatever our political instability problems in South Korea, we still have a very big military, economic, and geopolitical savior, or certainly ally, possibly savior, in the United States. One other point, remember this, H.R. McMaster, the National Security Advisor, in a speech that drew a lot of headlines earlier this week here in Washington, said President Trump has asked him and the Pentagon to develop brand new military options to deal with North Korea. That was also something the Trump administration intentionally laid on the table before President Moon arrived for these talks, creating not just an atmosphere in South Korea, but possibly North Korea and certainly in China about the kind of military options this president wants to review and may, in fact, at some point in the future, use.
Very, very interesting, Major. And you know, you're right. President Moon really sort of reinforced this idea of developing a bond of friendship, a bond of trust. He mentioned being on the same path when the two men were seated in the Oval Office, clearly trying to create an image that though there may be differences, we're on the same page.
Yes, and I think for the existential threat that South Koreans face, not just from a nuclear threat in North Korea, but from a conventional threat, and that's been an ongoing part of the South Korean psychology since the armistice was achieved in the Korean War in the 1950s. Anyone who, as lucky as I've been, who's gone to the DMZ and sees the geography of South Korea, sees the proximity of Seoul, knows how many conventional weapons the North Koreans train on Seoul and other parts of South Korea on a regular basis, know the sense of ongoing, almost hour-by-hour anxiety South Koreans feel from the North Koreans. And this larger issue of ballistic missile technology and the possible introduction of nuclear warheads on ballistic missiles that might be capable of reaching the western edge of the United States has amplified this confrontation with North Korea to a completely different level. Many previous U.S. administrations have dealt with this issue, but now it feels not only more dangerous, but more immediate. And this president's language moves the country and tries to move China's recognition of the alarm that this administration views North Korea with to a higher level, hoping to prod it into action. After the Mar-a-Lago summit with President Xi, this administration was extremely complimentary of what it believed the Chinese intended to do. But now, after the sanctions announced yesterday and the arms sale to Taiwan, it is clearly not as pleased as it once was, and is sending very direct signals to Beijing that its behavior better change or more will come in a hostile way from this administration. All
right, Major Garrett, I know you have to run. Really appreciate you popping in here and giving us your analysis. We're going to pivot over to Isaac. You heard what Major had to say. Do you agree that the level of tension is ratcheting up?
I do, and I think Warmbier's death is certainly a part of that. We still don't know exactly how he died. It could be something the North Koreans did. It could be something that he did to himself. But the fact of his tragic death is something that both leaders talked about and both mentioned as part of the reason why they're trying to get North Korea to change its path.
And Major also mentioned the idea of using maybe this language to nudge China along, and a level of disappointment, and he expressed that, a level of disappointment that more hasn't happened. Is China nudgeable, for lack of a better word? Because, you know, this has come up over and over again, that China is really the only country that can put any sort of pressure on North Korea that can make a difference, and they don't.
I think you bring up a great point. I don't think in this case China is nudgeable, and if it were to be, the costs on the U.S. side would be very high. I mean, China is the only country in the world that rivals the United States on economic, geopolitical, and military might, and they see the North Korea situation very differently. They think the best way to deal with North Korea is to nudge it to some sort of economic opening, sort of like what happened with China in the 1970s. And that's basically the opposite of what Trump wants.
Yeah.
So they just really see this situation very differently.
Yeah. The other big topic of conversation that will be occurring at these meetings has to do with trade. And, you know, President Trump has expressed his dissatisfaction with the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It's one of the things that he campaigned on, blowing up many of these partnerships, that being one of them. How do you see that going? What are the areas of contention?
I think the big problem here is that while the United States is trying to muddle its way forward on trade, China is proposing a different regional architecture of trade, one belt, one road, that allows it to define the rules of the road with trade going forward. So Trump might not like the TPP, and plenty of Americans were dissatisfied with that, but it was an American-led initiative that would allow America to determine how they want to trade with other nations, and now China's in the driver's seat.
Yeah, well, that was the concern, that if we blow up these trade agreements, that we're leaving an opening for China to come in. And over the past several years, we've seen China take advantage of different openings across the globe to have greater economic influence in Africa and other places. So as China is sort of looking on, what do you think they're watching for?
I think they're trying to see fissures in the U.S.-South Korean relationship. A couple of years ago, China was very, very close with South Korea. Former President Park was one of the few Western-leading leaders who appeared with Xi Jinping at a very important military parade. And then relations between China and South Korea have certainly worsened. So I think they're looking both for the public statements and private statements that get circulated around Washington. How close are these two men going to be? How much do they see eye to eye? And what ways is there for Beijing to exploit any differences between the two leaders?
Right, and you heard Major Garrett point out that there were some things that President Moon just basically ignored, and one of the things that he ignored had to do with trade and altering any sort of trade agreements.
I think another important thing to add on that is that the vast majority of credible economists in the United States don't really believe that Trump should be obsessed with this idea of a trade imbalance. That's Navarro talking right there, and most of the people who understand far more about this than I do really feel like that's a silly thing to be obsessed with. It plays well to his base. Americans like it, but it doesn't make economic sense. Oh,
see, that was one of the questions I was going to ask you, but it may not be your wheelhouse. But he said, a trade deficit of $11 million? No. I can't remember what the number that he said, but is there a massive trade deficit?
There is a massive trade deficit, but the fact that there is a massive trade deficit doesn't mean, like Trump seems to think, that we're getting screwed by these other countries. It's just a way that our economy is trading with them. And we have moved away in America with the kind of manufacturing that you get more of in South Korea and China. And we have an economy that's more focused on domestic consumption. And that's a perfectly healthy thing for an economy to be focused on. And it doesn't mean that they have an $11 billion advantage towards us. That just doesn't make any sense.
Isaac Stone-Fish, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.